Getting into medical school can feel like climbing a mountain, but what no one really tells you is that when you're finally in medical school, you realise that you've just arrived at base camp. Hey everyone, I'm Katie. I'm a fourth year medical student and one of the presenters here at the Aspiring Medics. And in today's video, we're taking a bit of a turn away from the interview prep structure videos and instead going to talk about my experiences at medical school and things I wish I knew before I started medical school. We're going to be going over the myths that turned out to be false, the realities which surprised me, and the lessons that I could go back and tell first year me. Some of them are reassuring, some of them are humbling, but all of them are true. So let's get started with the video. So the first point I'm going to make is that med students are actually really friendly. So a very common myth and something that I was particularly apprehensive about is that med students are not very friendly, they can be quite competitive and they're all gatekeeping their resources. However, when I first started medical school, everyone was so eager to make friends because everyone's in the same position of moving to university for the first time, they're away from family and everyone just wants to start making friends as soon as possible. And med students are very nice people. They always want to collaborate, share resources, and it's really easy to build up a good friendship network when you start medical school, which I think is something that's not discussed enough. This also relates more to the clinical environment too, where you'll realise as a medical student you'll always be going around the wards in groups or pairs, and you always have another medical student with you that not only relates to the learning that you're going through and the stresses of being a medical student, but is also able to perform clinical skills with you, do examinations with you, and give you feedback on your clinical performance. So you're always being able to nurture each other's growth as a medical student, and it really is such a collaborative career option. So the second thing I wanted to talk about is you are still able to have a life outside of medicine if you have appropriate time management skills. When I was about to start medical school, I was really worried that it would end up taking over my life. I would have no time to spend with family, or I wouldn't be able to play piano or dance or undertake the usual hobbies that I have in high school when I started university and started medical school. A big concern of mine was that medicine would end up taking over my life and that I would just be studying constantly, so have to attend lectures all day about medicine and come home and revise all the content related to medicine and then rinse and repeat every day. But the reality was actually very different. When you start medical school, there's so many opportunities for you to join different societies, to take part in research, to do other extracurricular work. There's also so many wider university societies that take part in the evening, for example, joining a basketball club or a football club, and there's just such a wide variety of things that you can do as a medical student that still gives you that authentic university life experience. If you do have a hobby, for example, you're a hockey player, you're definitely still able to undertake those kinds of things in medical school. And often each medical school has a designated society just to allow medical students to take part in sports and other activities because they have specialised times that work flexibly around your lecture times. So there's always an ability for you to keep doing what you love alongside medicine, and in fact it's actually encouraged by both your peers and your friends and the faculty at the university for you to have a life outside of medicine. It's really important as well to bear that in mind because I think on social media a lot of the time there can be unrealistic expectations for how much time people are spending studying or on clinical placements or how much their life revolves around medicine. But it's really important to bear in mind that you do have time to do the things you love, undertake those activities, particularly in the evening, as long as you're able to keep a diary or you're able to have a steady study plan. That means you have the ability to balance your self-care and your activities with having to study in medical school because you are faced with a lot of content, so it's really important that you're giving yourself the time to be able to study those things as well and not just prioritize your hobbies at all times. So I would definitely say in summary, you are able to have a life outside of medical school, but it does involve a lot of being able to manage your time effectively and be able to study when you feel like you do need to be studying the topics and being able to stay on top of your work, but also keep in touch with your hobbies and make friends outside of medical school too, because those connections are equally important for your self-care. So the next thing I want to talk about is how clinical placements are genuinely motivating. When I was about to start medical school, I had a general awareness that we had clinical placements. However, it felt quite abstract in the sense that I thought the first few years would be more about biology, physiology and anatomy and trying to understand that before applying it to clinical placements. However, I was faced very early on with our first clinical placements in general practice, and it was actually such a motivating and rewarding placement to have, because you're able to gain the knowledge from lectures and apply it to real life situations and the patient in front of you, and it allows you to gather a much wider picture about how different illnesses affect the lives of the people in front of you, and you're able to build up that rapport and connect with your patients, almost like the doctor-patient relationship, but from a medical student perspective. So I think that has been such a rewarding part of medicine that I didn't expect as much. And following on from that, when you're finally on your clinical placements in your later years of medical school, sometimes you can see such interesting conditions that you've been reading about, and you're not only able to appreciate how the symptoms actually present in a person, but you're able to have a proper conversation with the patient themselves, and you're able to gather and appreciate how different illnesses affect people's day-to-day life, and realize that it's not just a condition that you're learning about in a textbook, but these are actual conditions that people are going through and have a profound impact on their lives and the lives of their families. And that can really help, not only for you to appreciate what medicine actually really is at its core, which is about ensuring that patients are safe and we're doing our best to support our patients, but it's also about correlating that understanding of the physiology with being able to treat the patients as a person. So in essence, I didn't realise how motivating clinical placements would actually be, and I think it's such an affirming thing that we get to go through as medical students and rotate through all the different specialties, because you can really grasp how understanding medicine and the physiology behind different conditions applies to people in real life, and it really affirms your desire to want to be a doctor and help people. So now we're going to move on and talk a bit more about the things that surprised me when I was in medical school, and some things that I do wish people had told me about earlier. And the first thing that comes to mind is portfolio. So your portfolio is essentially a display of your achievements and your experiences that you gained throughout medical school and beyond, including in your first foundation years. And this showcase or display is actually really important for your specialty applications, depending on whichever specialty you want to do. And this means that throughout medical school, you can start gaining useful experiences and achievements that would help build this up so you look like a more attractive candidate when you're applying for different specialties in the future. And every specialty might have some different requirements, including different exams and different components of the portfolio that you can showcase. For example, an obstetrics and gynecology portfolio would be quite different from a psychiatry portfolio. So these are the kinds of things that it's important to have an awareness of in medical school. However, don't stress too much, because throughout medical school you will be presented with so many opportunities to try and build up your portfolio in different ways. And often you'll be building up your portfolio without even realising it. So in some ways that you can try and build up that portfolio, and the things that the portfolio entails is things like teaching, research, publications, clinical audits, and leadership opportunities. So commonly some things you can do in university is get involved with societies, whether it be a medical society or even an extracurricular society like a sport. If you get involved regularly, help to organise events and build yourself up within that society and potentially even lead that society one day, that looks really good for a leadership part of your portfolio. Another thing is research. I know a lot of people can be anxious about struggling to find opportunities to get research. However, if you put yourself out there, a lot of different clinicians are doing research in hospitals, and if you just ask around, opportunities do tend to crop up, and it's definitely something that you shouldn't be stressing too much about, because you'll have so many opportunities to build up your research experience after you graduate medical school too. Another important thing to talk about is clinical audits. So this ties in a lot with medical research as well. Most hospitals in every department are doing audits at some point in the year, or multiple audits, so it tends to be quite easy to try and get involved with those. But again, don't stress too much, because after you graduate it will become a lot easier to get audit experience. Teaching experience is something that's much more manageable in medical school, and there's numerous ways you can do this. For example, taking part in teaching series with different academic medical societies, or even teaching on a national scale, as there's a lot of different medical student platforms. For example, SUPTA, which is the Surgical Undergraduate Peer Teaching Association, and different teaching platforms like that. So There's always going to be national committees or things that you can take part in to showcase your teaching and leadership experience in medical school, which really helps to build up your portfolio. But again, not something to stress about too much, but good to have an awareness of. So another thing that was an eye-opener for me is that specialty competition ratios are very real and specialties are becoming very competitive in the UK. Before starting medical school, I tended to have more of the impression, alongside a lot of my friends and inside a lot of other aspiring medical students at the time, that if you work hard, study well, get good grades, you're able to do the speciality of your choosing. However, the reality is actually quite different. I didn't realise how many hurdles I'd have to overcome to try and do the speciality of my choice, which includes things like exams and trying to build up an appropriate portfolio. I also didn't realise how there was varying indexes of competition between what specialty you wanted to do as well. For example, cardiothoracic surgery, neurosurgery, ophthalmology, obs and gynae, and any broad surgical training tends to be much more competitive than other specialties, since it becomes quite important to bear that in mind when you're trying to build up your own portfolio and gain relevant experiences in those areas to try and look like a more attractive applicant. However, importantly, it's also good as a reassurance that you don't need to have a fixed speciality of interest in medical school. It's really important that you're able to stay curious and you're able to just say yes to opportunities that come your way, because you never know how much an opportunity might strengthen your application in the future and how you can use the experiences you've gained to strengthen your portfolio when you're applying for the specialty training in the future. There have been a lot of changes that have been made to the speciality recruitment process, and there's been a lot of calls for change to be made. So this is a very dynamic area at the moment, so things might change in the future for the better. But at the moment, ratios remain high, and that is something that I wish I was told sooner in medical school. And it's something that you can, however, prepare yourself for, and you can always gain more experiences, undertake experiences not only in medicine but in the wider community as well, for example charity work, volunteering, to try and build up your experiences and become a more well-rounded person in preparation for specialty applications. Another eye-opener, and something that I wish that I'd been told about more before starting medical school, is how the term dates for medicine vary so much compared with the wider university. And often we tend to be on clinical placements in times that other university students are calling their holidays. I did have a general awareness before starting medical school that medicine would obviously have some differences with the holidays that we receive, particularly as we are often on clinical placements and we're not spending as much time in the university building. However, what I didn't realise is that the holidays would be so vastly different as we currently experience as medical students. For example, as you progress through the years in medical school, you start to notice that your summers can become shorter. You have earlier starts in the morning, later finishes in the evening, and your holidays in general tend to become a lot shorter, or you may have less opportunities for things like reading week, depending on which university you do end up going to. This becomes relevant when you're starting to think about family events where you may not be available when the rest of your family would be free and everyone has a holiday except you. It's also important if you have friends out with medical school that are planning to do something in the holidays and you're not available because of medical school placements. However, it's also important to bear in mind at the other end of the spectrum that as a medical student you may be given holidays when other university students are still working or still undertaking their courses. So there is swings and roundabouts in terms of our medical school holidays. Another important thing to bear in mind is that the holidays that we are given, for example the Christmas break period or the Easter break period, often there can be exams that follow those break periods. So even if you're given a holiday, you might end up having to balance the relaxation with some studying, which is another thing I did expect going into medical school. However, I think it's also important to address in this video too. However, as a medical student, you can understand why the holiday structure is built as it is, because we are training to be doctors in the future, and you can imagine as you progress through your training as a medical student, you are gaining more clinical competence, given more responsibility, and as such your holidays do have to change and adapt quite significantly. But rest assured, you will still have significant time off, so don't worry about that. And finally, one thing I genuinely didn't expect when I started medical school is how much you grow as a person and how quietly it all happens. I feel when I first started medical school, I was so nervous to take a basic history from a patient. I didn't know how to examine any patients. I couldn't really think of many differentials as we were just starting to learn about the anatomy and physiology. And I had a real sense of imposter syndrome where you feel like everyone is doing so much better than you. But then somewhere along your journey in medical school, it all starts to fall into place. You start to realise that you can take a history without feeling nervous. You start to learn so many different examinations that eventually you end up doing without even thinking. And you can start to see patients on your own and think of appropriate differential diagnoses that are actually ending up to be accurate, and can think of appropriate management plans. And then you begin to realise throughout that whole process that you really are starting to think like a doctor, which is such a motivating and rewarding feeling. Often you don't even realise how much progress you've made until you encounter a younger student that was in your position those years ago, and it really helps to confirm in your head not only the amount of information you've learned about all the different body systems, anatomy, physiology, but also the soft skills that you've gained in the process. For example, how to build rapport with patients, how to de-escalate tense situations, and how to communicate effectively with the team. And you really start to realise that you're becoming the doctor that you've always dreamed of becoming, which I think is such an amazing feeling that you experience throughout medical school. So just to end on that positive note, the one thing I didn't realise is how much I would grow as a person throughout medical school and how rewarding the journey has been. So just as a final takeaway, and a message that I want to leave you with today, is that medical school is challenging, and that's something that I expected. I expected to have long hours, potentially less flexibility than other university students. I expected to have a high workload and have to study a lot more at nights, in the evening, or undertake more exams. However, what I didn't realise as much was that medical school is an amazing place to make friends. I've had so many opportunities to build up my portfolio. I've undertaken research, I've done teaching. I was able to keep up my love for piano. And I was able to find a speciality which particularly interests me, which I hope to pursue in the future. So I've grown so much as a person throughout medical school, and it's been such a rewarding, however, a roller coaster of a journey. But as we near the end of our medical school journey, I think it's important that I reflect on ultimately it's been a much more positive experience than I expected overall, despite it being challenging throughout. And I've made friends for life here in medical school, which I hope is something that can inspire the rest of you to feel a little bit less anxious when you're coming to start your med school journey. And that's it, everyone. Thank you so much for watching the video. I really hope you did find it useful or insightful at least. If you did like the video, be sure to like, subscribe, and comment down below if you have any questions at all, or if you have any of your own insights to share. If you did like this video, be sure to check out our other videos on our channel, which are mostly around interview content and learning how you can smash your medical school interview. I hope that you did like this video as a bit of a change of pace and more of an insight into what medical school life is really like and things that I wish I had known before starting. See you in the next video. Bye everyone!